Sexual harassment. It is one issue that divides men and women. The lines that crosses from acceptable behavior to harassment has been fuzzy, but a recent Supreme Court decision has clarified the definition. Tonight we'll discuss the impact of that ruling and the whole issue of sexual harassment. Good evening, I'm Patricia Gras. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled earlier this month that employees who sue their bosses for sexual harassment do not have to prove they suffered severe psychological injury to win damage awards. This decision easing the standards for winning lawsuits could potentially lead to more workers taking action against their employers. Just what is sexual harassment and how should it be dealt with? For a discussion on this topic, our guests tonight are Ellen Cohen, Executive Director of the Houston Area Women's Center, Donna Guerrero, Outreach Manager for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission office here in Houston, and Kathy Butler with the Butler and Harris Law Firm. Welcome, ladies. And I'd like to start with the definition of sexual harassment as it stands today, because it keeps changing.
Okay. Basically, EEOC is very, very pleased with the decision, Patricia. What the Supreme Court has now said is what EEOC has been saying since 1980, and that is that people in the workforce do not have to suffer unwanted sexual advances. If someone is coming on to another person and that person says no, basically the other person in the workforce has to listen. The other part of the definition of sexual harassment involves anything sexual in the workplace that's unwanted. It could be jokes passed around on a pass-out sheet. It could be sexual cartoons posted up on the bulletin board. Everyone in the office could find it funny, but if one person finds that thing sexually offensive, and a reasonable person would find that sexually offensive, it has to be removed.
Is the key word unwanted?
It is, definitely. The intent of the Supreme Court's decision is certainly not to prohibit people from joking. I know that there's been a lot of concern about that. But if someone's making sexual jokes in the workplace and the other person is joining in with that, there's no intent to stop that. We're not trying to make people less than humans or make them into robotons or something like that. What we're trying to do, and what the Supreme Court is doing, is basically telling the Sixth Circuit, which came up with this ridiculous decision, that, hey, for 7 years ago, we defined sexual harassment, and we really meant it. It's sort of like a parent who has to tell the child more than once that, you know, you're doing the wrong thing, now go back and clean up your act, and I think that's what happened here.
Did this ruling surprise you?
Well, no. I mean, I had to believe that it was going to come down the way it was, because the whole issue of having to show psychological impairment seemed so totally bizarre. In other words, I mean, you had to be on a ledge, you know, ready to jump before someone was going to say, okay, now we really believe that you've had a problem. I make the analogy to what we're looking at now in terms of the laws that we've put into place in terms of women who are being stalked. You know, it used to be if a woman was stalked and you called the police and you said, do something, they'd say, we can't. We can't do it until something happens. Well, that's, until what? Until I'm dead? Now, you know, if you call on the second time, then the police is obligated to do something. The same thing here. I mean, if it's reasonable, if a reasonable person determines that it's so offensive that you can't function in the workplace, you don't have to be prepared to be committed to an institution before somebody takes you seriously.
Where do you draw the line, though? How do you know when this sexual harassment is occurring and when it's not occurring?
How does the
victim
court
know?
Well, I mean, I think that any time the behavior such as happened to Teresa Harris, who is the plaintiff in this case, occurred, there's not going to be a question. I mean, her employer said, you know, you're nothing but a dumbass woman on many occasions. He had a practice of asking women to take coins out of his front pocket. He also had a practice of throwing coins on the floor and asking women to bend down and retrieve them. That kind of thing is clearly sexual harassment. The Supreme Court said, look, there's no mathematical formula, but we have confidence in the juries of this country, and they're going to know when someone has crossed the line and when they haven't.
And you know what's really sad, Patricia? There's a big myth and stereotype out there that people come forward and file complaints to get back at other people, and that is absolutely not true. The victims that we see that come into our office, and that's about 350 women a year come into our office, they have suffered horrible, horrible things, and they tolerate it for a long, long time. I had one woman call me the other day, an older woman, who was forced in her workforce to use the restroom in front of her employer. And the way the employer did this, he refused to put any lights in the restroom. The only way that she could see as she was going into the bathroom was to keep the door propped open, and he would stand there and watch. And if this woman had to go, those are the circumstances under which she had to do that. And she just tolerated this for the longest time, not realizing that she could put a stop to it. And of course, coming forward is very scary. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to come forward and put a stop to something. A lot of people just leave and find another job.
How about false allegations? You're saying that is not an issue, but that's an issue that comes up. Is it the minority? Is it a minimum amount of people who actually use this against somebody?
We basically don't see it.
Okay.
We see the number of false allegations in sexual harassment cases are the same, as we understand it and what we see, are the same number of false allegations in any case. Between 2 and 3% of allegations, whether it's whatever the case is, whatever the issue is, are false allegations. So that means that 97% of the time, people that come forward
Also,
are coming forward
isn't there a perception that because most of these cases are settled out of court, that if you're being harassed, or if a man or a woman is being harassed, that you're the only one? It's not happening to other people. Is that common? Do you see that as a common problem?
That's not true. If one person is being harassed, chances are that harasser is harassing other people. And when EEOC comes in and does an investigation, a lot of times we look for former employees who have worked for that same supervisor that are going to be more comfortable telling us the truth about what happened. And many times people who are being sexually harassed are in a position that's been turning over a lot over the past couple of years because this person has basically harassed others before them.
If people who are watching this show tonight are in a situation where they are facing harassment, those people, and a lot of people, have a question of fear. They fear losing their job. They fear the retaliation that could take place in case something wasn't done about it. How do you deal with that?
Well, one thing, don't mean to minimize that because that's certainly a serious concern, and I understand that concern, is that it is illegal to retaliate against a person for pursuing their rights under Title VII, which is what we're talking about. And so, if you have a retaliation, actually that's going to provide more evidence for the initial suit, and I would say that. But it is true that a lot of employers will try to discourage people in many ways, and indeed that former employees, current employees, will feel reluctant to come forward. So I think Ellen brought up a good point before we started the show, which is that the best approach is to start building a written record.
Yeah, that led to my next question. How do you build a case?
Well, I think that any time that something is said or something happens or pictures are put up or things that you find offensive, in which you go forward and say to the offender, look, I have to tell you, I don't find what you're saying, acceptable, and I want you to stop. And he or she says, come on, can't you take a joke? And you say, yeah, I can take a joke, but this is not funny. And they promise to stop, and they don't, and the next day it happens again, then you write it down.